Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another exciting talk today from the Oxford Guild with our Collegium Global Network and our partner societies from leading universities. We're holding this special online event with General H.R. McMaster, who formerly served as 26th United States National Security Advisor. In this role, McMaster occupied one of the most senior positions in the American federal government and worked in President Donald Trump's administration between 2017 and 2018. Prior to his experience in the West Wing, General McMaster served in the US Army as a decorated three-star general and was referred to by Time magazine in 2014 as possibly the 21st century Army's preeminent warrior thinker. He's also an author and best known for Dereliction of Duty, Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and The Lies That Led to Vietnam, which has been hugely influential and widely read in US military circles. As an expert on matters of diplomacy, international relations, and national security, he currently serves in an academic role at Stanford University, and following recent security concerns, was appointed to the board of Zoom Video Communications. Today, he'll be discussing some fascinating issues around geopolitics, including the US, China, and the importance of empathy in foreign policy, as well as answering all your questions. Thank you very much again, General McMaster, for taking the time today to join us and share your insights. And over to you. The floor is yours.
Hey, thanks, Harry. It is great to be with you and Abbas and the Oxford Guild. Thanks for the invitation and for the privilege of being with you. So what I'd like to do is talk to you about how U.S. policy and I think really the policy of the free world is evolving toward the Chinese Communist Party and how that evolution occurred. Maybe talk about some recent events and place them in context of really what the Chinese Communist Party wants, what it's trying to achieve, and then what our response ought to be across our free and open societies. Well, in 2017, February of 2017, I was walking down the street in my hometown of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, on my way to a small but mighty think tank called the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And I was on my way to brief the results of the study that I had commissioned as the officer charged with developing and developing the design for the future army, the study on what we were calling Russian New Generation Warfare. And this was really a focused look on how Russia had annexed Crimea, had invaded eastern Ukraine, but also how Russia had combined really a range of capabilities in a sustained campaign of political subversion aimed mainly at Europe, and was becoming more and more adept at using what we were calling initially, and I think as this concept has matured, cyber-enabled information warfare. On the way to that briefing, my phone rang, and it was a Washington number inviting me to go to Mar-a-Lago, Florida, to interview for the job of National Security Advisor. So I had been thinking about geostrategic competitions for years, and in connection with Russia, but increasingly in connection with China and the policies of the Chinese Communist Party. And as I took on the job of National Security Advisor with really not much preparation, the final interview was on a Monday. I had run into Ambassador John Bolton a little bit awkwardly in the men's room on my way to the final interview. And once I was hired, I started work the next day. I didn't even live in Washington, so it was quite a rushed period of time. But I brought with me into the job an idea that we were behind. We were behind in critical competitions internationally, because really since the end of the Cold War, we had lost our ability to compete effectively. And we lost our ability to compete effectively, I believe, because of the emotional impetus behind U.S. foreign policy and national security strategy, an emotional impetus that had shifted since the end of the Cold War from over-optimism to pessimism, from hubris almost to resignation. And of course, at the end of the Cold War, and many of you, I guess all of you here, were probably not even born in that period of time, which is amazing to me. At the end of the Cold War, I was stationed in Germany, and our regiment was patrolling the East German border when East Germany lifted travel restrictions to the west. So our cavalry troopers who were on that border were staring down East German border guards one moment, and the next moment saw the gates open, and then tens, and then hundreds, and then thousands, and then tens of thousands of East Germans poured across that border. Our soldiers were showered with bouquets of flowers, bottles of wine. There were hugs. There were tears of joy. The Cold War was over. The West had won. The Soviet Union was breaking apart. The Warsaw Pact was no longer. And so there was reason for confidence. And then, of course, the end of the Cold War was followed very rapidly by a hot war in Kuwait after Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990, August 1990. U.S. UK coalition forces deployed there and conducted a campaign to liberate Kuwait, during which Western armies demonstrated tremendous technological military prowess. And so these twin victories in the Cold War and a hot war in the Middle East bolstered our confidence. And many assumed after that point that there was an arc of history that had guaranteed the primacy of our free and open societies over closed authoritarian systems. And a corollary to that was that really great power competition was a relic of the past. The Soviet Union was no more. China really hadn't begun the rapid economic growth, and certainly was not a military power to be reckoned with. And so there was also a belief that really our security was unchallenged. Great power competition was a relic of the past. And by the way, our technological military prowess would ensure our security. And if any country had the temerity to challenge the United States and its NATO allies, that war would be waged quickly, cheaply, efficiently. Of course, some of you may be familiar with this term, the revolution in military affairs. Really, the next war was going to be fundamentally different from all wars that had gone before it. And so I believe this overconfidence of the 90s, also a decade of sustained economic growth, really brought into an era of complacency and disengagement from critical competitions that never really went away. They were ongoing, and that we weren't really participating in these critical arenas of competition. I think this overconfidence, this hubris, was in many ways a setup for the disappointments, the difficulties that we encountered in the early 21st century. Of course, the first of these was a mass murder attack against the United States on September 11th, 2001, where about 3,000 innocent people were killed by a ruthless enemy employing asymmetric capabilities. Really not coming at the United States in a way where America's technological military prowess was relevant, but coming at the United States with box cutters and airplanes. And so I think the first lesson is really there are two ways to fight the United States, the United Kingdom, technologically advanced adversaries. And those two ways are asymmetrically and stupidly. And in 1991, Saddam Hussein picked stupidly, and others learned vicariously through that experience, and were determined to fight the United States asymmetrically. This is the case also with Russia and the so-called Russian New Generation warfare, and it would be the case with China and China's competition with the United States and the West. But that strategic shock in 2001, of course, it led to the war in Afghanistan. It led, at least from an emotional perspective, into the attack into Iraq in 2003 and the unseating of Saddam Hussein's regime. Of course, a very controversial war that's often debated. I think what's debated most often is should we have done it? Should we have invaded Iraq? I think that maybe a debate question that's more fruitful is who the heck thought it would be easy? Why did they think it would be easy? And so we were confronted in the early 2000s with the unanticipated length and difficulty of the wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Our confidence had begun to be shaken, I think, by these difficulties. And then of course we have the 2008 financial crisis, which shakes our confidence even more. And I think it is in this period of time that the emotional impetus behind U.S. foreign policy in particular shifts from over-optimism to pessimism, right? From what you might say, overconfidence to resignation, and the belief that U.S. disengagement from complex competitions overseas was an unmitigated good. And I think what these approaches have in common is what I'm calling in this forthcoming book is strategic narcissism, the tendency to define the world only in relation to us and to conclude that what the United States and its allies and partners do is going to be decisive to the outcome. So whether that is is intervention in the case of Iraq in 2003, or disengagement from the Middle East, and I would say disengagement from complex competitions overseas in the post-2009 period in the Barack Obama administration. I would say that whereas maybe the George W. Bush administration underestimated, underappreciated the risks and costs of action, the Obama administration underappreciated the risks and costs of inaction. And so as I came into the job, I felt that we were behind largely because we were not competing effectively. This was the case with China, as it was in other crucial competitions in foreign policy and in national international security. So what we began to do is we put in place a process that allowed us to convene the principals committee of the National Security Council around these crucial challenges. And based on what I learned from my research and writing about Vietnam and my teaching and writing about the national security process previously, I was really determined that we were going to think about problem sets and challenges before we acted. And so we put into place what we called a principal small group framing session for each of these crucial challenges. And one of the first was on China. As you might recall, President Trump had a summit with President Xi Jinping in Mar-a-Lago, Florida, in early April of 2017. I went into the job at the end of February, so we had to really get this done quickly because we wanted to be informed by at least a framing of a policy approach to China prior to that summit. And what we did in each of these framing sessions is we tried to define these challenges on their own terms first, consistent with design methodology and design thinking. And then to identify, hey, what's the so what? What are U.S. vital interests and interests of our allies that are at stake in this competition and in this challenge? And then to view that challenge through the lens of those vital interests and to craft an overarching goal and more specific objectives. And then I think very importantly, as part of this process, we then identified assumptions that would underpin our policy approach to this crucial challenge. And a critical assumption was an assumption involving the degree to which we believed that the United States and like-minded partners had influence, agency over this problem set. And so this framing session was very helpful, I think. And what we did as part of this framing session as well was to try to identify what were the assumptions that underpinned existing and previous policies. And on China, this was particularly important because the assumptions that had underpinned our approach to China, I think, certainly since the end of the Cold War, you could say going back to the opening to China in the early 1970s, were now demonstrably false. And those assumptions were primarily that China, having been welcomed in to the international economic order, especially with most favored nation status in the 1990s, and then entry into the World Trade Organization in the 2000s, would play by the rules. And as China prospered, China would liberalize its economy, move away from its statist economic system toward a free market economic system that was compatible with free market economies across the world. And then as China liberalized its economic system, well, it couldn't help but liberalize its form of governance. And it's become clear, especially since Xi Jinping has taken over as chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, that those assumptions are demonstrably false. And so what we implemented was a fundamental shift in U.S. policy from a strategy toward China of engagement under these assumptions to one of competition and a recognition that because we had not been competing, that China had been able to advance its interests at our expense. And what we intended to do was to administer a corrective to this, I think, approach to foreign policy that I've described as strategic narcissism, but through an injection of strategic empathy. This is a phrase coined by the historian Zachary Shore, who I really recommend his work highly. He has a great book entitled Blunder. I think I have it here somewhere. Yeah, here it is. Blunder, which is why smart people make bad decisions. But he has another book entitled A Sense of the Enemy, in which he really lays out the case for how important strategic empathy is, and in particular, an element of strategic empathy, which is to consider what are the emotions and aspirations that drive and constrain the other. When we don't consider emotions, aspirations, and ideology, what we do is we fall into these traps. One of these traps is that we tend to mirror image and think that, well, the Chinese Communist Party leadership must be thinking about this relationship the same way that we're thinking about this relationship. We maybe focus too much on interests without recognizing the degree to which emotion and ideology drives and constrains the other. I mean, Thucydides understood this, right, 2,500 years ago, when he talked about competitions in war really being driven by fear and honor and interest as well. And so what we concluded is that the Chinese Communist Party is driven by a combination of fear and aspiration. Fear of losing the party's exclusive control on power. So what China does internally as well as externally is best explained by that effort to extend and tighten the party's exclusive grip on power. And then, of course, aspiration to, as President Xi Jinping said in the speech in October of 2017, to take center stage and to restore China's rightful place in the world. And so, what is China hoping to achieve? I think it's to perfect internally this Orwellian, technologically enabled surveillance police state. I mean, you see that police state being perfected in the wake of COVID-19. You see it aggressively pursued with the internment of 1 to 3 million Uyghurs in concentration camps. You see it now being extended into Hong Kong as well. And externally, I think what you see is a range of aggressive actions that are meant to establish exclusionary areas of primacy across the Indo-Pacific region, and even more ambitious goals in connection with the emerging data economy to achieve a position of predominant influence over that economy, as well as I think to set standards internationally that allow China to have preponderant influence over global logistics networks and supply chains as well. Now, how is China doing that? What's China's strategy to do that? There are really three main elements of that strategy. The first of these is military-civil fusion. And we in the West, we think, okay, free market economics, right? What are we worried about? Why should we mix our security concerns with economic relationships? Hey, if China wants to produce goods at artificially low prices and offer them to Western consumers at a markdown, isn't that to our benefit? But China doesn't distinguish really between what it's doing economically and what it's trying to achieve from a security perspective. And in fact, China is in a race, I think, in a race to dominate really in the area of emerging technologies that give it a differential advantage, not only in emerging market economy, but also militarily as well. And you see this in the application in particular of artificial intelligence associated that range of technologies associated with artificial intelligence. And you also see it, through other advanced technologies such as hypersonic missiles, for example, drone technologies, many examples of this military-civil fusion. An aspect of this as well bleeds over into a second strategy called Made in China 2025. And this is for China to gain a position of advantage in the development of advanced technologies, especially dual-use technologies that are relevant to China's really effort to achieve a dominant position economically, but also a dominant position militarily as well. Elements of this strategy involve a sustained campaign of industrial espionage, mainly against Western countries. You might recall in December of 2018, the indictments that 15 countries, including the US, the UK, Japan, many others, announced against APT-10, the main organization from the Ministry of State Security that is engaged in cyber espionage. But China is pursuing a broad range of efforts by infiltrating university research efforts, research organizations internationally, with a systematic extraction of that technology and a concerted effort to apply that technology to gain economic advantage, but also to gain military advantage. Of course, China engages as part of these two programs in a range of economic aggression that denies Western countries reciprocal access to the Chinese market, even as Chinese companies penetrate Western markets. The telecommunications sector is just one of these examples with Huawei and ZTE. I think it's extremely foolish for any country to let China, wheel in the Trojan horse of 5G communications infrastructure that would allow China to access data and use that data again to its own advantage, as it has. These are not theoretical cases. China does this on a continuous basis, and China is engaging also in other forms of extracting sensitive technologies, such as the joint venture law, which is for in exchange for access to the Chinese market, that U.S. and really other companies, international companies, have to transfer essentially sensitive technologies and intellectual property to that Chinese company, which, by the way, by law, must act as an extension of the Chinese Communist Party. And then the third strategy is really under One Belt, One Road, and this is China's effort to use its economic power to create servile relationships across the world, mainly in the Indo-Pacific region, but internationally as well. A major effort in Africa, in South America, for example. And China is doing this really by offering loans with really disadvantageous terms that set a debt trap for these countries, indebt them far beyond what they're able to service that debt. Often it involves trading of debt for equity to gain direct influence over key infrastructure. And this is where you can see many of these strategies coming together, where China is taking a very systematic approach to gaining influence over key geostrategic locations, as well as gaining influence over communications infrastructure as well. And so what should the response be? I mean, what should the U.S., the UK, EU countries, Japan, other countries do, India, do about this? Well, I think what we have to do is we have to compete much more effectively, and we have to be able to impose costs on the Chinese Communist Party for its aggression, which increasingly is becoming increasingly more dangerous. Right? What we see is with the border clashes along the Indian border, much more aggressive action in the South China Sea, ramming and sinking in April a Vietnamese vessel, ramming a second Vietnamese vessel, coercing a Malaysian vessel there, bomber and fighter overflights over Taiwan, more aggressive action in the East China Sea with these so-called maritime militia, and North Korea acting out, which I think is not disconnected maybe from what the party is doing. I think it's urgent that the United States and like-minded countries convey to China that we are going to take a unified approach to imposing those costs on the Chinese Communist Party. And I think why that's important is because Xi Jinping is emboldened in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis after infecting the world by suppressing news of the conference, by subverting really the true purpose of the World Trade Organization. The party sees itself in an advantageous position because China's emerging first, maybe out of this crisis, and sees what it perceives as weaknesses in Western economies, in the U.S. in connection with the protests and the racial divide that the murder of George Floyd has exposed. And so I think Xi Jinping thinks he's winning, and this is why he's becoming much more aggressive. So acting together, I think, is immensely important. And I think what we're into now is a decoupling competition, a recognition, even before COVID, that the aggressive policies of the Chinese Communist Party don't makes China really not a good place to do business. And U.S. companies are really wanting now to, and other companies are wanting to reduce their vulnerability to the coercive power of the Chinese Communist Party. So I'd like to talk more about this in Q&A, but essentially what we have to counter is the Chinese Communist Party's ability to co-opt companies and countries based on the lure of the Chinese market, the lure of short-term profits. Once those companies and countries are co-opted, then to use the party's coercive power to get others, whether it's the National Basketball Association or others, to support China's aggressive foreign policy and the extinguishment of the rights of its citizens internally, and then to conceal the party's practices and just act, well, this is just like normal business practices. So I think we need to pull the curtain back on these actions, whether it's the recent cyber attacks on Australia, or whether it's the sustained campaign of industrial espionage, whether it is the aggressive military actions across the Indo-Pacific. We need to expose it, not allow the Chinese Communist Party to conceal it, and impose costs on the party for its actions. We also have to make ourselves better. We could talk more about that so we can compete more effectively. But I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk with all of you. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you, and I look forward to seeing where you'd like to take the conversation. Thanks, Harry.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much for that. That was a really, really good and compelling overview of the importance for an international coalition and how we might go about that. Obviously, as you can imagine, lots and lots of questions coming in, picking up on different things that you're saying and sort of beyond. Figure this one would be a good one to start with. A question here coming from Michael, doing engineering at Oxford. Michael asks, you've been referred to as one of the grown-ups in the room of the Trump administration. What has surprised you most about the administration since your resignation?
Okay, well, I really think that in any administration, right, and I'm sure this is the case in any democratic society, right, whether it's in the in the White House or on Downing Street, is that there are three types of people who serve in any administration. I think the first type of person who's there is a person who is committed to help that elected president, prime minister succeed, and to do so by presenting options, plural, to that leader, recognizing, right, that is that president or prime minister who was elected, not the national security advisor or cabinet official. And then I think a second type of person is maybe not there to help that the elected leader pursue his or her agenda, but is instead there to advance their own agenda. Now, that could be a policy agenda, or it could be a career-related agenda, right? And that could be an agenda associated with like Iran policy or immigration policy or trade policy. But they come into that administration because they have an idea of what they want to do, not what the elected leader wants to do. And the third type of person is somebody maybe who casts themselves in the role of maybe being this adult in the room and says, okay, well, I think I'm here to save the country and the world, from this particular leader, right? And this is, I think, typified mainly by this anonymous writer, in the U.S. And I think what's dangerous in a democracy is that second and third type of leader is I think not only doing a disservice to the president or prime minister, but is actually diminishing the people's voice and the people's really ability to hold their own elected leaders accountable. And so in the U.S., I think the second and third type of leader undermines the Constitution of the United States, right? Because, hey, nobody elected a national security advisor to make policy. They elected a president to make policy. And so what I saw my job as really providing those options to the president. I mean, I think most of you have heard. I mean, I never held back in giving the president what I thought was not just my best advice, right, but best advice across all the departments and agencies of the government, as well as perspectives from our allies. And so I think that I was able to serve the president well in that 13 months I was there. But hey, I'll tell you, in that environment, you get used up, right? You get kind of used up, and I was at peace with that. When I was done, I was done. I mean, what my research had taught me from Vietnam is that some leaders in the Lyndon B. Johnson administration, they thought, hey, I can't tell the president what I really think, because if I do, I'll lose my influence with the president. Of course, that begs the question, hey, what good is your influence anyway if you're not going to tell the president what you really think? And so I think that, I think that maybe after I left, it seems as if anyway, people who fell into those second and third categories may have had more to do with policy decisions.
Very interesting. Got a question here from Dan doing geography at Cambridge. Dan asks, or Dan says, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us and for such an interesting talk. Do you anticipate that China will ever start playing by the rules?
Yeah. No, I don't. Not under the Chinese Communist Party. So, in fact, when we worked on the assumptions on which our China policy would be based, in fact, I wrote about this in an Atlantic Monthly essay. I think it's the most recent essay, the most recent issue of the Atlantic still, and within that essay, I talked about the assumptions that we replaced those flawed assumptions I'd mentioned. And I think foremost among them was that the Chinese Communist Party will not liberalize, and this is because it prioritizes maintaining its exclusive grip on power, even when it is clearly in the economic interests of the party. And you recall the party really had said for years it had to maintain at least 6.5% GDP growth per annum to meet the rising expectations of the population and to grow out of the middle income trap. Even if it makes sense really to liberalize the economy more, to rely less on state-owned enterprises, more on companies that are more independent and entrepreneurial, it's not going to do it, right? In fact, what it's doing is it's doubling down on state-owned enterprises and a lot of the overcapacity and overproduction problems it already has. And the reason is these companies are an important mechanism for the parties maintaining control. And so I don't think they're going to liberalize unless really the Chinese people demand it, right? And that's, I don't think the United States should put itself, or any country should put itself in a role of trying to change China. I mean, I think the Chinese people have to change China. But I think what we should do is ensure that our policies don't aid and abet and strengthen the party's effort to stifle human freedom and to advance its interests in the region in a way that usurps, not only the authority of its own citizens, undermines the authority of its own citizens, but also the sovereignty of nations in the region.
Great. Okay. Here's a question coming from Jane doing an MBA at London Business School. Jane asks, you've recently joined the board of Zoom, a company we've all used and become familiar with. How have you found that experience so far, and what will you focus on?
Well, I'm just wondering why we aren't on Zoom right now. I'll tell you, I believe I joined the board of Zoom because, first of all, I think it's a social good, right? I mean, I think the technology that Zoom is bringing to the world is bringing people together. What I am so sad about, when I look at just in the United States, but also globally, is how divided people have become, how vitriolic rhetoric is around issues that we ought to be able to have civil conversations about. I think that social media plays a really destructive role in this, right? Because of the business models associated with social media, in which really these companies are incentivized to show users more and more extreme content that pulls us apart from each other. Of course, Russia, as you've seen, has really become very adept, right, at using social media to polarize Americans and Europeans and others around key issues. And so I think a conferencing capability like Zoom, it brings people together where you can have really discussions that have an arc to them, where people can really empathize with one another. I think it's the extinguishment of empathy that we have to be most concerned about. So anyway, I was excited to join Zoom because I think, okay, this is a social good. And especially at the time of this pandemic, right? I mean, people are coming together, not just business, which is what it really is designed for, but in the arts and in education and then socially. And I don't know how many of you are doing this, but I'm reconnecting with a lot of my old friends, and we're coming together for Zoom cocktail hours, that are allowing us to really really compensate for what otherwise could be a really isolating experience due to the COVID-19 crisis. I think Zoom also, as you've probably seen, is kind of on the front lines of really having to cope with the coercive power of authoritarian regimes, right? And how do these communications companies deal with that, right? And so to be able to help the leaders of the company, who I think are really just good people, working hard to make the company as good as it can be. I mean, it's a privilege to do it. So I'm learning a lot. I'm not a business person too, so it's an education for me. I'm learning more and more about technology as a result. So thanks for the question, but hey, switch to Zoom here, for Oxford Guild.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, next time. Okay, yeah, here's a question from Darren doing history at Warwick. Darren asks, do you agree that China's relative calm following the incident on the Indian border illustrates that it is not beholden to its own nationalism in the way some have suggested?
No, I think so. I think it is beholden to its own nationalism. The party is. But I think what happened with the party is maybe they didn't order this to happen. What I'm concerned about here now is that if you look at Chinese Communist Party propaganda, look at what's been directed at our free and open societies with the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, right? Think about, though, what's been happening internally in China in terms of the steady diet of the narrative of national rejuvenation, right? So if you watch, and this of course coming from Chinese friends of mine, if you watch Chinese television, the news on Chinese television, right, the first 15 minutes is about the wisdom of Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party leadership. The next 15 minutes is about how great the country is becoming based on the agenda of national rejuvenation, the tremendous accomplishments of the party and so forth, the growth of the economy, great economic achievements, the prowess of the People's Liberation Army, right? And then the last portion is how screwed up the West is, right? How screwed up, the UK, the US, Italy, whatever, you pick a country is, right? And so I think, having been fed a steady diet of that, how many of the Chinese people are believing it? How many in the People's Liberation Army believe, hey, now's the time to kind of flex their muscles, right? So I think that it's a dangerous time in large measure because maybe the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, is believing its own propaganda.
Definitely a scary prospect. Another scary prospect being asked about here from by Rachel doing biology at Imperial. Rachel asks, with Euroscepticism on the rise in Italy, how much of a threat to world order do you think that the escalating uncertainty around the future of the European Union is?
Yeah. Well, I'm pulling for the European Union because I think that our free and open societies who share our democratic confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes, we have to be stronger together, right? And I think that I think this could be a moment of opportunity for the European Union. My friend Timothy Garton-Ash, who I'm sure many of you know as a brilliant scholar of really of the West and really a strong voice for freedom during the Cold War, an important scholar for understanding the transition from the Cold War period to the post-Cold War period as countries from the Warsaw Pact and former provinces in the Soviet Empire gained their independence. He has a line in which he says that nothing focuses the mind like the prospect of death, right? And so I think it's time for the European Union to sort it out, right? What are the expectations of the EU vis-a-vis the sovereignty of the member countries? Maybe the EU, I think, got too ambitious. What wasn't clear enough in really what the EU was and what it should mean to the member states. COVID-19, I think, has exposed the importance, right, of strong sovereign states within the EU. And the EU doesn't have a medical response capability. It wasn't designed to, right? That should be in the province of the states and the member states. I think a soft Brexit is in the interest of the EU. I think keeping the family together, right, based on our shared principles, is immensely important. And I think there ought to be a backlash, obviously, to really the heavy-handed tactics of both the Russians and the Chinese, who are cynically trying to use, Euroscepticism to divide European polities, again, pit people against each other. As you know, Russia's been particularly adept at cultivating nativist parties, like the AfD, and also leftist elements within Germany, for example, to weaken Germany's resolve to be a member of the European defense community and of NATO, for example, and to play its part in rending the transatlantic relationship. So I think it's time for everybody to stand up. I think that we could take advantage of the overplaying of China's and Russia's hand in Europe. I hope to galvanize Europeans and really to emphasize the common identity and that we have based on the principles that we hold dear.
Well, glad that you mentioned Russia there, because being asked about that further by Andre doing law at LSE. Andre asked, will Russia continue to act as a major player on the world stage for much longer, or does its protracted economic decline destine it to fall into relative insignificance?
Well, I believe it could fall into relative insignificance if it didn't have like a huge nuclear arsenal, and if it didn't have an unscrupulous government, right? If you're unscrupulous, you can get a lot done with relatively little resources, right? When you attempt a murder using a banned nerve agent in Salisbury that could have resulted in the deaths of hundreds, you're unscrupulous, right? And so when you aid and abet, these serial mass murders that are occurring within the Syrian civil war, you're unscrupulous, and you can probably get a lot done, right? When you are aggressively engaged in cyber-enabled information warfare, you can get a lot done. So I think Russia's going to remain a threat, but I think Vladimir Putin has some serious problems now. I mean, it's pretty obvious. This is supposed to be a big year for Vladimir Putin, right? You had the extension of his world referendum is coming up, the end of this month. It's a week of, I think, mail-in voting, and then I think the final voting day is July 1st, right? The same day where the victory parade for the 75th anniversary of the end of the Great Patriotic War, the postponed celebration, is to take place, right? But this is supposed to be a year of great celebration and triumph for Vladimir Putin. What did he get instead? Right? He got a number of protests at the end of last year associated with the manipulation of the Moscow municipal elections. He also has a lot of popular discontent associated with the mishandling of the COVID crisis there, the lack of capacity, ability to mobilize medical resources, especially in rural areas. There's a second wave coming in Russia right now that's complicating that for him. The collapse of oil prices didn't help as well. And he's been stymied in many of his international adventures, right? In Syria, the offensive in Idlib province has petered out. The Assad's army is not capable to continue that offensive. Having killed scores of Turkish soldiers in Idlib province, Turkey responded by sending 2 divisions into Idlib in a way that's going to frustrate Assad's ability to gain control of the entire country. And by the way, Turkey then exported, this now proxy war it's fighting really against Russian proxies into Libya, right? So Venezuela, that's a drain on Russian resources. Putin bailed out Rosneft to the tune of $4 billion, even while he's extending the retirement age in his own country. Okay, that's not playing well in Russia. So I think Putin's got some real problems. I think it's time for Russian leaders to say, hey, maybe we ought to rethink this orientation to the East, and maybe think Russia as a responsible member of a European community, could be really good for the Russian people. I mean, it seems to me to be an obvious choice. And so I think what we ought to do is, as in China, right? I mean, for those that are not under the Kremlin's direct control, for those that are not under the direct control of the Chinese Communist Party, we ought to try our best to maximize positive interactions, with Russian students studying at Oxford, with commercial relationships, and try to build a bridge to a post-Putin Russia that is better integrated with the West and with Europe in a way that was envisioned and hoped for in the 1990s, but ultimately sadly failed due to the failures of Russian reform efforts in the 90s, the financial crisis in '98, the rise of Putin, in the early 2000s.
Yeah, certainly would be nice if Russia came into the sort of Western fold. Here's a question from Cyrus, who's doing HSPS at Cambridge. Cyrus asks, do you think that Trump's maximum pressure strategy on Iran might only serve to push them into the hands of China?
Well, I mean, they're already in the hands of China, right? Because, they don't have a lot of friends, you know what I mean? So I think they don't have a lot of friends because they act like a terrorist organization, right? They continue to wage a 4-decade-long proxy war against the United States, Israel, the Arab monarchies, and the West broadly, right? And I think the maximum pressure strategy is important because it forces the Iranian leadership to make a choice. You can't have it both ways. You can't act like a terrorist organization and be treated like a normal nation state with all the benefits of being treated like a normal nation state, especially the economic benefits, which gave the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps and the Supreme Leader more and more resources to intensify its proxy wars, which, by the way, has the Middle East enmeshed in the greatest humanitarian crisis since World War II, right? And this is really, Iran's role in perpetuating a cycle of sectarian violence that has created tremendous hardship for the people of the Middle East, but actually is designed to keep the Arab world perpetually weak and to allow Iran to apply essentially a Hezbollah model to the region broadly, which is where they have weak governments in power that are dependent on Iran for support, while Iran creates militias and illegal armed groups outside of the government's control that can be turned against that government if it acts against Iranian interests, right? This is what Iran had in Lebanon, has in Lebanon with Hezbollah. It's what they are trying to perpetuate in Iraq, what they have in Syria, what they were trying to do in Yemen. And this is all to I think, to extend hegemonic influence across the region. This is what's called a forward defense strategy that was put into place, during the Iran-Iraq war. But it's offensive more than defensive, because the design is to place a proxy war on the border of Israel, right? And so I think it's in all of our interests, right? The interests of the entire free world to impose costs on Iran until it chooses to be a nation state instead of perpetuate these proxy wars.
Interesting. Got another question here about just to do with China, coming from Ian, who's a biochemistry graduate from Cambridge. Ian asks, what, in your opinion, will happen for the Taiwan issue, respectively for the scenario of a Biden or continued Trump presidency?
Well, I think there's going to be a lot of continuity on China policy and vis-a-vis Taiwan. And that's because really, I mean, it might be the only issue in the United States right now that has a really strong bipartisan consensus behind it, right? And I think it's because of the actions of the Chinese Communist Party, right? I mean, it's for those who were so hopeful, right? So hopeful for China to liberalize. There are still a few that still hold that as a prospect, but I mean, they're in like a tiny island now. I mean, because Xi Jinping has made it so obvious, in a way that's profoundly disappointing for not only Americans but across the world. I mean, I think that I give credit to really John Garneau, who was a journalist in Australia who did really a brilliant job at exposing really the malign actions, the malign influence of the Chinese Communist Party in Australia. That set off really a range of studies that have been conducted since then, pulling the curtain back, right, denying the party any longer the ability to conceal really what it's trying to achieve. I mean, long time China hands, right, in the U.S. who are cheerleaders for China, right? This is John Pomfret, who's written a brilliant book, which I highly recommend, called the Beautiful Country and the Middle Kingdom. It's about U.S.-China relations going back to the 18th century. It's just so well written, and it's a brilliant use of kind of subtle historical analogies through the whole book. But these are people who wanted China to succeed, right? And of course, China's narrative is, oh, this is the United States trying to keep China down, and contain China. No, it's not. It's just a rational response to an increasingly aggressive Chinese Communist Party. And this is why it's so important to have multilateral action on this. China will take a divide and conquer approach. And this is why the EU, the UK, Japan, the US, India, we all have to work to Australia. We all have to work together. And I think, act together in ways that impose costs on the Chinese Communist Party and demand an end to its aggressive actions, whether they're economic actions or what we're seeing increasingly and dangerously, military actions.
Great. Got an American domestic question here from Eddie, who's a reserve officer, training corps cadet and student at MIT. Eddie asks, is the US military-industrial complex resulting in the US developing defense technologies that are inefficient relative to Russia's or China's? An example of this being the F-35. Can this be rectified?
So the answer is yes. And yes, it's happening and it can be rectified. And so I would say that it has to do with the military-industrial complex for sure, right? And I would add, to that complex, you have, of course, you have big defense companies. You have members of Congress, who are supportive of those companies. The Department of Defense, that's always been the triangle of the military-industrial complex. But I would say some think tanks now as well, right? Who advance really, these sorts of proposals to buy more of, fill in the blank, the latest exquisite capability. And I think what we've seen is really a dangerous kind of inclination toward a return of the orthodoxy of the revolution of military affairs from the 1990s. I wrote a few essays about this years ago. I think one is called When Gadgetry Becomes Strategy, a short op-ed called The Pipe Dream of Easy War, and a few others, an article on survival. But this orthodoxy was really based on the idea that U.S. and Western technological military prowess, right, would overmatch any potential adversary in a way that would either prevent them from even having the temerity of challenging the United States, or if they did, the war would be fast, cheap, efficient, ways from standoff range, and so forth. And of course, they this orthodoxy ignored, this obvious observation. This is Conrad Crane's phrase that I used earlier, that there are two ways to fight, right? Asymmetrically and stupidly, right? You hope your enemy picks stupidly, but they're unlikely to do so. And what Russian new generation warfare is really in large measure an effort to apply some old technologies and a few new ones to take apart what Russia sees as the West's differential technological advantages. So Russia's not developing stealth capabilities; they're developing sophisticated and tiered air defense that can maybe defeat stealth capabilities. They're also going back to some old technologies like electronic warfare, jamming capabilities. Instead of building vast constellations of satellites, they're developing anti-satellite capabilities, dazzling ones, and direct attack capabilities. China as well. Instead of a large number of aircraft carriers in the case of China, they're developing anti-ship missile capabilities. So subsurface capabilities for naval capabilities, drones, swarming drones. Massive. Instead of really relying on precision strike, look what Russia does. Russia just sends some drones out in eastern Ukraine, identifies kind of the general grid square, and then barrages that grid square with massive artillery and rocket strikes. So I think these are all asymmetrical capabilities. Not to mention, really, what some people are calling gray zone conflict, hybrid war. These range of capabilities that are designed to achieve outcomes below the threshold that might elicit a military response. This is what China is doing with the maritime militias in the East and South China Seas, for example. So anyway, I think what we have to recognize is that we need a range of defense capabilities to cope with enemies, adversaries who are going to fight us asymmetrically. And I think that since the end of World War, really since World War I at least, but before that, there's been a trend to to trade off capacity, right, for capability, right? So if you imagine a graph, okay, where capacity or capability is on the x-axis and capacity is on the y-axis, there's been a line that's sort of gone, it's gone lower here like this, okay, right? And so we've been able to trade off for the automotive revolution, the aerospace revolution, the precision revolution, communications capabilities, satellite capabilities, the size of forces, right? So fewer and fewer, smaller forces can have bigger impact over wider areas. Well, I think all these countermeasures, right? Sophisticated tiered air defense, counter satellite capabilities, electronic warfare, offensive cyber capabilities. I think it's reversed that trend. And so I think now we need probably more systems that are less expensive. And if we don't take them, and probably bigger armies and navies and air forces, right, to have enough capacity to cope with these challenges. So I think the train's reversed, but we may be on a course, if we don't correct it, toward what one of my UK colleagues called exquisite irrelevance, right? and so we have to be careful about that. There's been a book written here in the U.S. By Christian Brose called Kill Chain, which makes this argument. But yes, I think we're maybe on the wrong path in terms of how we've prioritized our modernization efforts versus capacity and the kinds of systems we're developing, systems that could maybe are prone to catastrophic failure rather than graceful degradation. So, but I think we have in our power to correct that course, and we need to have those discussions, right, across NATO and other allies as well.
Right, that's a really interesting way of thinking about that. Here's a question sort of on the US, I guess kind of beyond, coming from Jake, who's doing law at UCL. Jake asks, we've seen the so-called deal of the century be led by Kushner. Does it worry you that the civilian has such an important role? What do you see as the future of the enduring crisis, presumably the enduring crisis in Israel?
Well, the deal of the century, the deal that was put forward, of course, that may not, that may become not as important as the decision that Prime Minister Netanyahu may make soon to annex the West Bank, right? So of course, with the Israeli-Palestinian issue, you have a range of like super hard problems, right, that nobody's been able to solve, right? And these problems mainly involve territorial claims. The future now of East Jerusalem. It involves the right of return issues, and really now the question of can the Palestinian territories ever hope to become a viable state? Is the two-state solution as envisioned in Oslo, is that even? Is that feasible anymore? And I think what the effort, the U.S. Trump administration effort, if there's a benefit to it, it was at least it showed a proposal that could be politically palatable to one of the parties. Okay, now the disadvantage is, right, the Palestinians weren't in on it, right? But the advantage is at least it's out there. It can be put on a shelf. You can say, okay, maybe the Israelis might be able to buy this, because what you have now is a problem in which no deal seems feasible at all because of the fragmentation, the personalization of Israeli politics and the move of Israeli politics to the right, and the weakness of the Palestinian Authority, right? And so who's going to be able to deliver a deal on both sides? That's even in doubt, no matter, regardless of what the deal is. Now, of course, what to watch with the annexation of the West Bank is the potential of this, increasing the frustration of the Palestinian people in such a way that they become more sympathetic to extremist groups, like as has occurred in Gaza, in a that horrible, destitute situation in which really Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad is perpetuating, that crisis in a way that was such that they can maintain power and continue to pose a threat to Israel and perpetuate, the tension, the conflict, and just the horrible conditions there. I mean, does that bleed over into the West Bank? Let's hope not, for the sake of the Palestinian people and the humanitarian crisis that could follow. But then, of course, what happens in Jordan as well, right? And does that put pressure on King Abdullah and from the Palestinian population that, of course, would understandably try to demand more of a say in how they're governed if they are now governed within the borders of Jordan, right? So I mean, it is such a dynamic situation now. I think what Mr. Kushner and others focused on is to try to use Arab states' primary concern of the Iranian threat to enlist a higher degree of support for some sort of an agreement in which those Arab states would be supportive economically, at least for the Palestinian population. Now, of course, that leaves a whole lot of issues unresolved. But hey, I think the attempt in and of itself was not inherently negative, and I mean, it remains to be seen what the developments are. That deal, though, or that proposed deal, is not going to be the decisive factor here in the next few months. I think it's going to be what happens in connection with the annexation of the West Bank.
Very interesting. Here's another question, sort of to do with similar theme to an extent, coming from Philip, doing international management at KCL. Philip asks, what are your thoughts on Bolton and others disclosing inside information from the White House in books, providing transparency, yet undermining public trust?
Well, I'll just tell you what I decided to do, right? So when I came out of the White House, I wanted to write a book, right? And the book I decided to write was a book that would help explain, help readers understand the most crucial challenges to international security, and to propose ways in which we could overcome those challenges, right? Work together to overcome those challenges. So that's the book I decided to write, because really, I kind of, when I came out of the White House, I thought, hey, what am I going to do? I was in the Army for 34 years. I mean, I worked at a famous restaurant called McDonald's, before that. That was my only other job that I had, So it's only, so in my new career here, going into academia, what did I want to do? And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to contribute to a debate, discussion over these most crucial challenges in a way that helped reverse kind of the polarization within our societies and provided an opportunity to have a nonpartisan discussion as a basis for common action, not just in the U.S. but with like-minded partners internationally. That's not the book anybody wanted me to write. I mean, including my own family, right? And of course, publishers, my agents, they said, hey, this is really going to be to your financial disbenefit. I mean, why don't you write the book everybody wants you to write? About the palace intrigue, the inside scoop of what's happening in the White House. And the reason I decided not to do that is I thought it wouldn't be very satisfying for readers. I just thought, is that really going to be satisfying for readers? Is that going to be a material contribution to society? And then also I thought it would be a violation of trust. A national security advisor is unique, I think, in the structure. Mark said, well, my good friend, he's still in the job, going strong in the UK. It's unique in that you're the only person really in the foreign policy establishment who has the president, or in the UK case, the prime minister, as his or her only client, right? So you have the foreign ministry if you're the foreign minister, or if you're the Secretary of State, you have the State Department, right? So you have to be trusted if you're to do your job. And I think to write a book like that, I felt that it would for me, my choice, right, it would have been a violation of trust in a way that wouldn't only affect, Donald Trump, but what are future presidents going to do? Are they going to trust their national security advisor and bring that national security advisor into discussions that are important to national security decision-making and policy-making? I mean, The other aspect of it is that you already alluded to this in the question, is that, would this benefit adversaries, by providing perspectives that can allow them to advance, their interests at the expense of the United States. So I decided not to write that book, and I'm glad I didn't. And so yeah, I can't. I'll just speak for myself on that one. But thanks for the question.
I think it's a great point. Here's a question again, sort of about the previous or the current administration from Andrew, who did economics at Exeter. Andrew asks, does the president really believe that withdrawing from NATO makes sense for the United States, or is this just a threat to make other members increase defense spending?
No, I don't think he believes that. But I'm not in on the most recent conversations. But I think that there are key members in the administration who make the case for NATO, but it does make it harder when countries aren't sharing the burden. And excuse me, and I think really what's important is this isn't about Donald Trump, and I think this is really important for our European friends to understand. There is a tremendous amount of momentum building behind kind of a neo-isolationist sentiment in the United States, right? And this is, I think this is really due to a number of factors. One of those factors is unchecked globalization in terms of the effect that a globalized economy had in key sectors of the U.S. Economy and U.S. industries, particularly manufacturing industries, really disadvantaging U.S. workers in key communities in the Midwest in particular. It also has to do with frustration, as I mentioned, over the wars, the unanticipated length and difficulties of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. There are issues of economic inequality, inequality of opportunity in the U.S. that are frustrating. And what that's reinforcing is this idea that, hey, what are we doing underwriting, security for others when they're not pulling their fair share of the load, right? And this is why in the U.S., you have these really strange political bedfellows of George Soros and Charles Koch, right? One person who's kind of right-wing libertarian, one who is left-wing internationalist, both of whom are funding these kind of pseudo think tanks. I have an essay about this in Foreign Affairs this month. If anybody's interested, it's a real page turner. I'll tell you, it's called the retrenchment orthodoxy, I think, or the retrenchment syndrome, I think is what it's called. But it's really highlighting the deficiencies in the thinking behind this neo-isolationist movement. But Donald Trump didn't come out of nowhere, right? And he reflected in many ways this frustration. There's a great book by George Packer called The Unwinding, written long before Donald Trump, but in its pages, which tells the stories of individuals and communities affected by the transition in the global economy in the 90s. I mean, you can see Donald Trump coming. There's also a very good PBS, Public Broadcasting and ProPublica joint frontline show on Dayton, Ohio, which is also worth looking at. So this is kind of the frustration. Hey, when Germany's only investing 1% of its GDP in defense, and the U.S. rotation of troops to the European Defense Initiative, the annual cost, and when the annual cost of the U.S. cost of doing that is 33% of Germany's defense budget, hey, things are out of whack, And so I think I think that it would be really important for countries within NATO, to really demonstrate, that they're on a path to pulling their own fair share of the burden.
Great. Okay, we've got about 5 or 6 minutes left, so we'll see if we can get through a few more questions in that time. Here's a question about nuclear weapons from Diana doing an MBA at INSEAD. Diana asks, are nuclear weapons and the concept of MAD fit for purpose in 2020? What concerns you most about the arsenals of the likes of North Korea, Pakistan, Israel, and potentially Iran?
Yeah, well, of course, proliferation is a problem because MAD may not work, right? Mutual assured destruction may not work in terms of a deterrent capability. With Russia, Russia actually, I think, was in many ways, and still is, pursuing capabilities that were destabilizing from the perspective of preventing, the use of the most destructive weapons on Earth. And this is in the development of these intermediate range weapons in violation of the INF Treaty, and by just being loud, about this doctrine of escalation control or escalation domination or escalate to de-escalate, in which Russia was making explicit threats to European nations to strike them with a nuclear weapon, and then saying to the United States, hey, is it worth the nuclear holocaust to you, or are you ready to bargain with us so we can accomplish our objectives? So I think that the U.S. Had the right response in getting out of the INF, right? If only one party is adhering to an agreement, it's a fantasy, right? It's not an agreement, and the development of some of these intermediate range capabilities are meant to protect Europe, right? They're meant to make sure that the extension of the U.S. nuclear umbrella to Europe remains viable. And in many ways, what the U.S. is doing now vis-a-vis Russia is analogous to the response to the SS-20 missiles in Europe in the 80s, and the response being the Pershing II missiles. So maybe this can be, and you saw that there were negotiations initiated yesterday with Russia. We need to bring China into this and others on whether or not the START treaty can be can be salvaged as a first step in reinvigorating nuclear arms control negotiations. That's important. It's very important to get going, I think. Very important to bring China into it as well. In terms of the other countries you mentioned, North Korea, maybe Iran, the problem with those countries is, that the threat is not only to, their use of a nuclear weapon, or their use of it for deterrent capabilities. I believe, for example, North Korea wants a nuclear capability so it can coerce the United States off the peninsula as the first step of unifying the peninsula under the red banner, or red colored unification, as the regime calls it. And so therefore these nuclear weapons are meant, right, to have an effect immediately on the U.S. presence on the peninsula, and as a first step in also isolating Japan as well. I think China is not doing what it can in this situation, because China has a U.S. strategy while the U.S. is pursuing a North Korea strategy, and would like to see the U.S. pushed out of Northeast Asia. The other problem with North Korea is North Korea has never met a weapon it didn't try to sell to somebody. And in fact, it was already exporting its nuclear weapons program to Syria when the Israeli Defense Force bombed the facility in Dar Zor in 2007, I think, right? I think it was 2007. So anyway, I think these countries have been designated terrorists, and there are designated terrorists in North Korea and especially Iran. And what's to say they wouldn't sell it to a weapon or give a weapon to a terrorist organization? So I really think this is an immense danger. And again, we tend to take this like strategic narcissist view, right? And say, well, North Korea, they want this weapon just to deter us. I mean, I don't think so. I think North Korea's motivation is quite different from the mirror imaging that we tend to do when we look at their nuclear program.
Great. Just time for a couple more questions here. Here's one from Zach about Trump doing English at Cambridge. Zach asks, how would you interpret Trump's increasingly bellicose rhetoric against Black Lives Matter protesters / rioters in view of China's anti-protest measures in Hong Kong?
Well, I don't think there's any kind of equivalency there, right? So if you look at the actions of U.S. law enforcement, the National Guard, if federal troops were to be employed, they would have been employed to protect the American people, including the protesters, to ensure that those protests didn't get infiltrated by criminals or extremists who were burning down businesses, businesses of people maybe who had saved their whole lives, to open a store, and now it's in flames in the midst of a pandemic and so forth. So, I mean, the language that was used, was inappropriate, unfortunate, like the word dominance. I mean, how about just, search for the word dominance and everything and put the word protect in instead, right? But I think that what's materially different are the actions, that are taken, and the respect that the United States has for protesters, that it go all the way back, to our revolution, right? And so, I mean, I think that there's been zero effort to stifle, freedom of expression in the United States, whereas the Chinese Communist Party is really determined to deny the Chinese people a say in how they're governed, right? And this is why I think that we ought to be confident and celebrate our democratic systems, right? I mean, what the benefit of a democracy is in large measure is the ability for the people to affect change short of revolution, right? That our government has to respond to the people because we can vote them out, right? In the U.S., in our constitutional form of government, we have checks in place from our legislature, those who are supposed to most directly reflect the will of the people, especially in the House of Representatives, and in the judiciary, who ensure that the executive and the legislature behaves in a way that's consistent with rule of law and consistent with the Constitution. So I think, of course, I think when Xi Jinping looks at our free and open societies, he sees weakness, right? Hey, that freedom of the press, that's a weakness to be exploited, right? We don't have that here in China. We're stronger. Rule of law is a grave threat to the party because the party is supposed to be the only power, right? And it exercises that power arbitrarily. We have due process of law. Nobody's getting arrested and put in prison in any of the countries that are seeing protests around the world in democratic societies, because at the whim, of an authoritarian regime. So I just think now is the time that we ought to be really renewing confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes.
Okay, great. His question, talking about an area that we haven't quite talked about yet, from Darius doing maths at UCL. Darius asks, do you think that infighting within the Saudi royal family puts the kingdom at threat of implosion?
Yeah, it's really hard to tell what's going on within the Saudi royal family, but of course there are stressors, right, on the royal family now that weren't even, that didn't exist even several months ago. You had, of course, the announcement of MBS as the Mohammed Salman as the crown prince, followed by really a crackdown against other wings of the family, royal family. You had following that counter-corruption effort, that may also have been really used mainly to consolidate MBS's power against other wings of the party, especially that Mohammed bin Nayef's, who had been the previous crown prince, and supporters of him, and of course. Mohammed bin Salman had a very aggressive, reform campaign. Well, it doesn't sound like what he's doing is very reformist, especially when you consider the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, a journalist and U.S. resident, in a horrific way. But Mohammed bin Salman had also alienated to a certain degree the very conservative clerics with a reform effort that's trying to move kind of the religious ideology within Saudi Arabia from sort of a Salafist Wahhabist ideology to a more moderate Hanafi type ideology, and to take on issues associated with what has been, I think, the most successful effort at proselytizing in modern history, which is the export of that extremist ideology since the 1970s. Saudi Arabia exporting that ideology. As well as going after the financing associated with it. It's alienated, I think, elements within Saudi Arabia, and then the very ambitious economic agenda. The Project Neon and so forth. Now COVID and the collapse of oil prices, right? And so yeah, there are huge strains. I think it bears watching. I don't know enough about it myself. I don't know if anybody really does, right? I mean. But it's royal family internal dynamics are certainly, I think, catalyzed, right, by recent events, especially COVID and the collapse of oil prices.
Great. Do you think there's time for two more questions, just sort of quick, or just one?
I think just one. Sadly, I think just one. I'm really enjoying the conversation, though.
Okay, great to have you here. guest end on this one. This is a nice one from Adam, doing history at Harvard. Adam says, many of us consider you to be an inspirational role model and wish you were back in government. Who were some people who inspired you or who you looked up to when growing up?
Oh, well, thanks for that. That means a lot. I'll try to live up to that. I mean, I've been inspired by historical figures in U.S. history in particular, and especially those I think who were committed to serving because they wanted to make a difference in real people's lives and contribute to our nation and to humanity, right? And so role models for me have included, George Marshall has been an important role model for me, I think, as a military officer, and others who, were determined, I think, to do what was right for the country and not to advance really their own personal agendas. I'm a big fan of again, just to stick with the military because that was my background, of Ulysses S. Grant. I think he's super, underrated. There's a new series on the History Channel of the U.S. on it. I think it's pretty good. I'd recommend reading his memoir, which is really superb. I mean, I think it's the best memoir in that genre of military memoirs. And I mean, it could go on with other examples, but those are two who inspired me. And then I've had role models, mentors across my career in the Army, and it's always been those who put kind of accomplishing the mission and their soldiers first, and didn't really care about whether they're going to get promoted or not. I think a lot of times, I know there are a lot of really talented young people here today. I mean, I would just ask you, consider, hey, what is your base motivation in whatever your pursuit's going to be? And I think if your base motivation is, hey, you want to do good for other people, you want to contribute to society, to your country, hey, I'll tell you, that is a choice that will simplify your life. It will take so much stress off of you because you don't have to calculate how what you're going to say or what you're going to do is going to be perceived by those who might help you advance kind of more of a careerist agenda. And so I think that these days, a criticism of some people is that gaining notoriety has become an end in and of itself, rather than accomplishing something for which you may or may not gain notoriety. And so I think I was always inspired by those who I could see, that their base motivation was to contribute to society, to their country. So thanks for that kind question.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, General McMaster, for taking the time to speak and share your insights with us in what's been a really informative and wide-ranging session. Thank you also to everyone watching for your many challenging questions. We recommend you keep an eye out for his new book, Battlegrounds: The Fight to Defend the Free World, which is coming out in September 2020. And we hope you'll join us again soon for our upcoming events. Thank you very much, everyone.
Hey, Abbas, thank you so much. Real privilege to be with everybody. Thank you.